Hey everyone, we got some huge news for Rocket Lab stock investors on August 8th as the company announced its quarterly financial results. I'll review those figures for you in this video and answer what it could mean for Rocket Lab stock investors. So let's take a look. I want to thank the Motley Fool for sponsoring this video. Visit fool.com/Parkev for the 10 best stocks to buy now. Right. Rocket Lab reported $44.2 million in revenue in its latest quarter, and that was up 71% year over year, driven by an increase of launches from 3 to 4, as well as significant growth in our space systems business. Sequential revenue increased by 15% to 13.5 million increase, driven by growth in their space systems business, primarily driven by revenue from their MDA and SDA contracts. That being said, their gross profit margin was down slightly sequentially due to a weaker mix in space systems. Now, Rocket Lab investors should not expect this company to generate profitability in the near term because the company is still in the early stages of growth and early stages of investment in research and development to expand their capabilities. Still, the company did generate $106 million in overall revenue in the second quarter of 2024, and that was an increase of 15% from the previous quarter. I already mentioned that revenue increased by 71% or $44.4 million from the previous year. So the company does have orders, does have backlog. There is strong demand for its services. And what's interesting for Rocket Lab stock investors, what I like is that the company receives the cash first before it performs the service. So that's a big deal, especially for an industry like space, like Rocket Lab is trying to penetrate. It's very capital intensive. It takes a lot of investment, takes a lot of dollars to build out these capabilities. And if Rocket Lab had to put up the cash up front before it got paid from customers, that would make for a much more difficult business because the company would need to get that money first from investors. And investors look at this industry as a high-risk, high-reward industry. And so if they were to lend money or give equity money to Rocket Lab, it would come at a high cost of capital because of the risk. And so if Rocket Lab is getting the money from its customers, that's the best way to secure funds for investment in research and development, for investment in these services before it actually goes out and spends that money. So that business model decreases the risk significantly. And for investors, it's a signal that there is strong demand. If customers are willing to pay upfront for a service, that's a signal of strong demand. And the reason why investors are willing to pay upfront is because they want to secure their position. It's not unsimilar to some other industries that have so much demand and limited supply where there is a backlog like this and customers are willing to offer better terms in order to secure their spot in line. And this is a good position to be in, an industry where demand is up here and supply is down here. And that's why customers are willing to go out of their way to offer certain better terms in order to get their place in line. So speaking of that backlog, Rocket Lab has $1.067 billion worth of backlog as of the second quarter of 2024. And that was an increase of 5% from the previous quarter. And that's good news because this backlog eventually turns into revenue, right? So every quarter that backlog is getting worked on and it's decreasing because Rocket Lab is performing those services and the backlog is decreasing. And so if you don't get new orders, then your backlog will just keep falling as you perform those services. So with the quarter-on-quarter increase of 5%, that suggests that Rocket Lab got more orders than it performed in services in the quarter. And that's great news for Rocket Lab stock investors. That's what you'd like to continue to see, because that's demonstration that the company's revenue will continue rising because they just keep getting more orders and they fulfill those orders and then they get more orders and they fulfill and they get more. And so that's great news. What would be a little bit concerning is if you see that backlog start to drop dramatically. That would be concerning because that would mean that they're not getting new orders, that they're executing on existing orders, but they're not securing new orders. And so when that backlog is depleted, then the company may not have new customers because they're not getting new orders. But what we saw here was great news. And to break down their backlog, they've got $772 million in space systems backlog, $772 million, and then $294 million in launch. In the current quarter, backlog in launch systems is the area where they experienced the most significant growth, increasing from $215.6 million in the first quarter up to $294 million in the second quarter. And this was partially offset by a step up in space systems revenue recognition. So most of the services they performed in the quarter was for space systems. And so as I highlighted earlier, as they performed that system, the backlog decreases, and they weren't able to offset that with new orders. And so for the space systems segment, you saw the backlog actually decreased from $799 million down to $772 million. That was a $27 million decrease in the backlog, but it was more than offset by the roughly $80 million increase in backlog in their launch system. Now, the company expects approximately 44% of that backlog to be recognized within the next 12 months, and then 56% to be recognized beyond the next 12 months. So these aren't very long-term contracts in the future. For instance, if you evaluate a company like Boeing, their backlog is upwards of hundreds of billions of dollars, and most of that is going to happen several years into the future. That's not the case with Rocket Labs, where they expect most of the backlog, or not most, but 44% of the backlog over the next 12 months. Now, expenses are an important thing to monitor with Rocket Lab because they are losing money on the bottom line. And from the first quarter to the second quarter, operating expenses increased slightly. And the majority of the increase came in the form of selling, general, and administrative expenses, which increased from $28.8 million to $30.5 million, whereas research and development increased from $38.5 million to $39.9 million. As an investor, I'd like to see more of the expense increase in research and development and less in selling, general, and administrative expenses. The general and administrative expenses is where a lot of waste happens sometimes in corporations, and so to be safer and to be more productive, I prefer more of the spending happening in research and development, because this is where products and services come from. This is where new products and new services are launched. And so spending in this category leads to increasing revenue, whereas spending in general and admin is just necessities. And I'd like to see the company control these costs, things like rent for your corporate headquarters, salaries for senior management, the annual Christmas party, travel expenses for senior management, those types of things where I'd like to see them, instead of having to travel for a meeting, can you do it over Zoom? Is it possible to do it over Zoom? If it is, can you do it over Zoom? Do you have your corporate staff coming into the office? Is it possible to have some of them do remote work and lower the expense of office space? Those kinds of things where I like to see corporations control costs. But when you're in early stages of development, like Rocket Lab, it's not that much of a concern in these stages, but it's a good discipline to start with so that when you do grow and you do become a larger business, you've got into a habit of controlling costs. So a lot of big news here for Rocket Lab stock investors, and it's an exciting company with massive potential as long as they continue performing, continue executing on their roadmap. Before I let you go, let me tell you about the greatest deal on YouTube. With just a click of a button, you can get free financial analysis from a professor with decades of investing experience. So what are you waiting for? Hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you again soon.